The announcement came just as the last bell rang. The crackle of the intercom cut through the chatter in the hallway, making everyone pause. The principal's voice was flat and oddly calm. "Attention staff and students. This is a lockdown. Repeat, this is a lockdown. Please secure your classrooms immediately." The laughter, the shuffling of backpacks, and the plans for after-school hangouts dissolved instantly. The fluorescent lights above buzzed as the hallway filled with a nervous stillness. Doors slammed shut one after another, like dominoes falling down the corridor. My teacher, Mr. Hensley, shoved the door closed and locked it with a shaky hand. His eyes darted toward the windows before pulling the blinds down with such force that one nearly snapped off. We all huddled into the corner furthest from the door, just like in every drill. Knees pressed against chests, breaths shallow. But this time, it didn't feel like a drill. Nobody whispered, nobody giggled. The air was heavy with unspoken fear. Minutes passed in thick silence. The only sounds were the hum of the heating system and the occasional cough muffled into a sleeve. But then, faintly, from the hall, there was something else, a shuffle. A dragging step. The sound of a shoe scraping against linoleum. At first, I thought it might just be a teacher moving quickly, maybe making sure doors were locked. But the sound didn't have urgency, it had weight, a slow pull, as though someone was dragging something heavy behind them. Mr. Hensley froze, head tilted toward the door, listening. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling us to stay silent. The footsteps stopped outside our classroom. There was no knock, no attempt at the handle. Just silence. Every one of us was holding our breath, waiting for the sound of the door being tested. But instead, we heard something worse, a soft laugh. Low. Choked. As if someone was trying not to let it out but couldn't stop it. It slid under the door and into the room, prickling the hairs on the back of my neck. One of the girls near me whimpered. Mr. Hensley's eyes shot to her, wide with panic, his hands trembling as he mouthed, "Quiet." The laugh cut off instantly, as though whoever was outside had heard her. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then came the knocking, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Not frantic pounding like you'd expect in an emergency. 3 sharp raps on the wood, each one echoing through the classroom. Mr. Hensley stood, moving quietly, and gestured for us to stay put. He tiptoed toward the desk, pulling out his phone. His fingers shook so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He dialed quickly, put it to his ear, and waited. His brow furrowed. Then his expression drained to pale confusion. He lowered the phone and stared at it. The screen was black, though I had seen him unlock it moments ago. He pressed the power button again. Nothing. Dead. Another student pulled out her phone to check, then another. Each one lit up briefly before flickering off like a candle snuffed by wind. A dozen students tried, and every single phone died in our hands. From the hall came another sound. Not laughter this time, but whispering. Dozens of overlapping voices, all low, all speaking in tones too faint to make out. They seemed to slither under the door, crawling along the floor and walls. Filling the air around us, one boy clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't just sounds anymore, they were inside our heads. I could feel the words pressing at the edges of my mind, like fingernails scratching from the inside. Mr. Hensley stumbled back from the door, eyes wide and unblinking, muttering to himself. "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." The knocking started again. Harder this time. Louder, then, without warning, it stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. The whispers died. The dragging footsteps retreated slowly down the hall, fading until they were gone completely. Minutes passed. 10, maybe 20. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, the intercom crackled again. Attention staff and students. The lockdown has been lifted. You may return to your normal schedule. The voice was calm. Too calm. Something about it was wrong. Mr. Hensley didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the speaker above the chalkboard, his face drained of blood. One of the braver kids stood up, stretching his stiff legs. "Guess it's over," he whispered, trying to sound casual. He moved toward the door. Mr. Hensley snapped out of his daze and grabbed the kid by the arm, yanking him back so hard the boy stumbled. "Sit down," he hissed. "Nobody leaves this room." The boy's face flushed with anger, but the fear in the teacher's eyes silenced him. We stayed in that corner, waiting, even as the hallways beyond seemed to come alive again with the sounds of lockers slamming and kids talking, except it didn't sound right. The voices outside were hollow, like echoes in an empty cave. The footsteps were too synchronized, too deliberate, all hitting the ground in the exact same rhythm, and then we heard it again. That laugh. The same low, broken laugh we'd heard before, but this time, it wasn't in the hall, it was in the classroom with us. At first, it was faint, as though it had slipped in unnoticed. Then it grew louder, bubbling up from the back of the room, though there was nothing there but desks and shadows. We scrambled closer together, eyes darting around, searching for a source that wasn't there. The laughter rose higher, stretching into something distorted and wrong, like a tape being played too fast. One of the blinds snapped open on its own, slamming against the window frame with a violent crack. And through the glass, pressed up against it from the outside, was a face, not human. Its skin was pale and stretched thin, as though it barely clung to the bone beneath. Its eyes were hollow sockets, yet I could feel them staring straight into me. Its mouth was too wide, lips torn at the corners, still curled into that grotesque laugh. I screamed. So did half the class. The lights above flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. In that blackness, the laughter surrounded us. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was all of us. I could hear my own voice laughing, even as I sobbed, even as I covered my mouth to stop it. My throat ached, my chest heaved, but the sound poured out of me against my will. Mr. Hensley tried to shout, but his words dissolved into that same terrible chorus. The last thing I remember before everything went white was the feeling of cold hands, dozens of them, grabbing me from the shadows. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the hallway. The lights were back on. The air was calm. Students walked past me, chatting, laughing, heading for the buses as though nothing had happened. I stumbled to my feet, searching for my classmates, for Mr. Hensley. But the hallway was full of strangers. Their faces looked normal at first, until they turned toward me. Each one was smiling. Too wide. Their lips split at the corners. Their eyes hollow. They laughed in unison, the same sound that had chased me in the dark. I ran, pushing through the crowd, desperate for the exit. The doors at the end of the hall loomed closer. I burst through them into the daylight. The campus was empty. No buses. No cars. No people. Just silence, and then I heard the intercom click on again, echoing from speakers all across the deserted school grounds. Attention staff and students. This is a lockdown. Repeat, this is a lockdown. Please secure your classrooms immediately. The sound carried through the air, looping endlessly, and as it did, every door around me slammed shut at once. I was outside. Alone. Locked out, but the laughter was still with me. It always would be. The announcement came over the intercom in a sharp crackle, the kind that made the hairs on your arms rise before the voice even spoke. Attention staff and students. This is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown. Secure doors. Lights off. Stay silent. It was only 3 in the afternoon, but the fluorescent lights in the classroom hummed with an eerie finality as Mrs. Harding locked the door and pulled the shade. The blinds rattled faintly, like bones in a drawer. We all shuffled into the corner farthest from the door, the same way we had practiced so many times before, only this time, it didn't feel like a drill. The room went still, save for the whisper of breath and the occasional creak of the building settling. My classmates huddled around me, knees pressed to chests, eyes wide. The silence wasn't complete, never was in an old school like ours, but every groan of the pipes, every tap of the heater, seemed unnaturally loud, like the building itself was trying to remind us it was alive. I could see Mrs. Harding crouched by the window, her profile illuminated by the faint spill of streetlight outside. Her face was pale, tense, her lips tight as if she wanted to whisper comfort but knew better than to make a sound. That's when I noticed her hands trembling against the sill. Not fear of the unknown, she was watching something. It started faintly, a dull thud from down the hallway. Another followed. Then a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across linoleum. Everyone's heads lifted in unison, I straining toward the door. I tried not to breathe too loud, the sound grew clearer. Not hurried footsteps like you'd expect from someone running through the halls during a lockdown. This was slow. Purposeful. The scrape of something that resisted movement, followed by silence that seemed to hold its breath with us. Then, again, the dragging. I pressed my face into my sleeve, trying not to whimper. The lock on the door looked so small, so flimsy, just a piece of metal that suddenly didn't feel like it could keep anything out. The noise stopped right outside. The classroom door quivered once, just a subtle rattle of the handle. My chest tightened. I heard one of the kids start to cry softly, quickly muffled by another hand. Then, after a pause, there came 3 slow knocks. Not frantic. Not urgent. Deliberate. We froze. Mrs. Harding shook her head violently, signaling us not to move. The knocks didn't come again. Instead, there was a faint scratching sound, like nails lightly dragging across the painted wood, tracing a circle around the doorframe. It went on for what felt like forever. Then silence. We waited. Minutes passed. No more dragging, no more knocks. Eventually, Mrs. Harding gave a tiny nod, as though telling us to stay still but that the immediate danger had passed. The tension in my chest loosened just enough to allow a shaky breath, but that's when I saw it. From under the crack of the classroom door, something shifted. Not the shadow of feet, but the faintest line of darkness sliding slowly along the floor. Almost like smoke, but too solid. It lingered there, writhing, before retreating back into the hall. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. The intercom clicked on again. A voice, this time deeper. Rougher, echoed through the school. Lockdown is over. Return to your classes. Lockdown is over. Mrs. Harding's head snapped toward the ceiling speaker, her eyes wide with disbelief. She reached for her phone, fumbling in the dim light. A quick tap illuminated her screen, and I caught a glimpse of the display before she darkened it again. No messages. No alerts. Nothing from the office. Stay where you are, she mouthed. But a rustle passed through the group of kids, some of them shifting as though ready to move. One boy whispered, "They said it's over," and started toward the door before Mrs. Harding grabbed his arm and yanked him back. Not a word, she hissed, her voice so sharp it made me flinch. That's when the intercom came alive again. "Mrs. Harding, open your door." Every head snapped up. The voice wasn't the principal's. It wasn't anyone I'd ever heard before. It was low, flat, and drawn out in a way that sounded almost mechanical. It said her name with perfect clarity, but too perfect. Like it was being read from a script. Nobody moved. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing in from all sides. Until finally a noise broke it, the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. Except, as they faded, I realized it wasn't footsteps at all. It was that same dragging sound, disappearing into the distance. The rest of the night blurred into a haze of waiting. Hours passed before the Real police arrived. They moved us out of the classrooms one by one, checking IDs, confirming parents. Mrs. Harding refused to unlock the door until she saw their badges pressed against the window. When they led us into the hallway, the sight made my stomach drop. The floor tiles were scuffed in long streaks that stretched down the corridor, as though something had been dragged on its stomach for dozens of feet. Dark smears stained the linoleum, not quite blood, not quite dirt. And in the middle of the hall, right outside our classroom door, was a set of marks etched deep into the tile, for parallel grooves, as though something with claws had braced itself against the ground. The police never explained it. They searched the building, reported no intruders, no evidence of anyone inside. The announcement system, they said, had been shut down since the drill earlier that morning, but what unsettled me most wasn't the marks on the floor. It was the hallway itself. As they walked us out, guiding us past familiar classrooms, I realized something was wrong. The corridor we stepped into was longer than it should have been, stretching past the gym and looping back into a wing I didn't recognize. I had been in that school for 3 years, but I had never seen those classrooms, those doors with their frosted windows, that endless stretch of lockers. Even the officers looked uncertain, their radios crackling with confused chatter, and then, as quickly as it began, the hallway ended. A single door stood at the far end, unmarked and slightly ajar. A gust of air drifted from the gap, carrying with it a smell of earth and mold, like the breath of something buried underground. The officers led us the other way before we could see more. By the next morning, the hall was gone. I walked past the gym myself before classes began, and the space where the corridor should have stretched was just a blank wall. No doors. No lockers. No trace it had ever been there. No one believed me when I tried to explain. They said the lockdown had been a mistake, a miscommunication during the drill. They said the marks on the floor were old damage from moving equipment. They said my mind had filled in the rest, but I remember the voice on the intercom, smooth and unnatural, speaking Mrs. Harding's name with perfect certainty. I remember the black smear that seeped under the door, and the scratching sound tracing the wood, and sometimes, even now, when the building is quiet and the lights flicker in the hallway, I swear I can still hear it, the dragging. Slow. Relentless. Getting closer. The lockdown had turned the city into a ghost town. Streets once alive with the hum of traffic and chatter now echoed only with the faint scrape of tires against asphalt and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Elena's apartment sat on the top floor of an aging building, its brick walls weathered and grey, the kind of place where the faintest whisper carried like a scream. She had been alone for days, the hours blending into one another in a rhythm dictated only by her breathing and the occasional flicker of the fluorescent light in her kitchen. It started subtly. At first, it was the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She had lived in the building for years and knew every creak and groan. Yet these were different, deliberate, almost measured, echoing softly against the walls outside her door. She told herself it was the building settling, or perhaps another tenant moving about, but a knot of unease had already begun to tighten in her chest. Nights became the worst. The lockdown left her with nothing but silence, a quiet so deep it pressed against her eardrums. Then came the tapping, soft and irregular, like someone drumming their fingers along the window pane. At first, she ignored it, telling herself it was the wind. But it never came when the wind blew. It came at night, always when the streetlights outside had flickered off, leaving her apartment in darkness. One evening, she thought she saw a shadow cross the hallway outside her door. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the peephole, waiting for a reflection, a sign, anything that would explain the movement. Nothing. She pressed her ear to the door. The hallway was silent. Sleep became impossible. Every time her eyes closed, she imagined someone standing in the corner of her room, their face obscured by darkness, watching. She began to notice other things, tiny inconsistencies in her apartment. The kitchen knife she always left in the same spot was slightly off. The living room chair was not where she had left it. She chalked it up to exhaustion, paranoia, the mind playing tricks in isolation. Then came the phone calls. She never answered, yet the screen would light up with numbers she did not recognize. No voice, only static, a low, grinding sound that made her teeth ache. And sometimes, she could swear she heard breathing, slow and deliberate, as if the caller was leaning close, waiting. The building itself seemed to conspire against her. Pipes groaned like tortured screams, walls shifted imperceptibly, and the lights would flicker even when the electricity was off. She tried recording it, capturing the sounds and movement on her phone. But playback always revealed only silence and stillness. It was as if the apartment existed on a plane where the ordinary laws of reality no longer applied. One night, drawn by a compulsion she could not resist, Elena stepped into the hallway. The tap of footsteps followed immediately, soft, quickening as she moved. She turned the corner, heart hammering, but there was no one. Only the dim light at the far end of the corridor, flickering as though it too was alive, pulsing in rhythm with her own panic. She began to see things in reflections. Mirrors, windows, even the shiny surface of her laptop screen sometimes betrayed a figure standing just behind her. Always obscured, always just out of focus. Yet impossible to ignore. She stopped looking directly, instead noticing shadows that didn't belong, movements that made her stomach twist with dread. The tipping point came when she found a message scrawled on her bathroom mirror in what appeared to be condensation. The letters were shaky, uneven, I see you. She knew she hadn't written it. She hadn't taken a shower in hours. Her pulse raced, and she backed away, tripping over a chair. When she looked again, the mirror was clear, pristine, as if nothing had ever been there. Sleep finally claimed her one night, but not before she saw it, a dark figure crouched in the corner, taller than a man, its limbs unnaturally long, head tilted to the side. It didn't move, didn't breathe, only watched. She woke with a scream, drenched in sweat, the room empty. The shadow had vanished, or perhaps it had only retreated. Days bled into one another. She stopped answering her phone, stopped stepping into the hallway. She barricaded the doors, taped the windows, and yet the feeling of being watched never left. She began speaking to it aloud, whispering questions into the darkness, demanding it show itself. Silence replied every time, except for the occasional faint tap, or the low grinding static that echoed in her skull. It was the sound of her own name that finally broke her. She heard it whispered from inside her apartment, a voice eerily familiar, dripping with malice and familiarity. She froze, staring at the kitchen doorway. Shadows pooled there, thick and dense. And then she saw the reflection in the oven door, a face pressed to the glass, grinning in a way that was both human and impossibly wrong. Elena ran. She fled into the hallway, arms flailing, tears blinding her. The building responded. Doors slammed shut behind her, lights flickered violently, and the air itself seemed to pulse, thick with some unseen weight. She reached the stairwell, breathing hard, only to find the stairs stretching impossibly, elongating into a tunnel that twisted beyond reason. She fell, rolling down the steps, but when she landed, she wasn't in the lobby. She was back in her apartment, standing exactly where she had been when she first saw the reflection in the oven door. Her phone buzzed violently in her hand. The screen flashed one image, and she screamed before it even fully loaded. It was her. Or rather, what looked like her, but twisted. Eyes too wide, mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. And behind her, in the reflection of her own horrified gaze, was the figure. Watching. Waiting, the tap came again at her window. Only this time, it was accompanied by a whisper, low and gravelly, "You can't leave." Elena's breath caught, and in that moment, she realized the horrifying truth. She had been alone, but she had never been alone. The apartment had never been empty. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement had belonged to something that had been living with her, watching her, learning her patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to remind her. And now it had, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The lights went out. When they returned, she was gone. The apartment was silent, except for the faint tap of footsteps in the hallway.